Hey, what's up, Good Life? Thanks for joining me for today's 128 moment. Sometimes the first step is the hardest. A typical novel contains about 75,000 words, but the writer's first sentence, it might be the most elusive. When you know you need to get back in shape, the most difficult step might be that first step away from the refrigerator. And I've never been skydiving before, but I imagine that first step out of the plane is a doozy. Now, to cover the gap between where we are and where we need to be, we have to first take a first step. The same is true in the area of obedience and in the way we live our lives for Jesus. Now, when we realize that our ways don't align with God's will, something has to change. Either our heart will harden against Him in our disobedience, or our lives will conform to Him in obedience. There is absolutely no in between. Now, this moment of decision is complicated further when the right thing is not the easy thing. There will be times in life when our obedience will be costly. Moments when doing what God wants will put us at odds with everyone around us, at odds with the current culture. There will also be moments when the circumstances that God allows into our lives feel like they're more than we can ever bear. We know God's faithful. We believe He'll never leave us or forsake us. But our first step toward obedience, or our first step into that trouble, sometimes that can be the hardest. When we're called to take a difficult step, the Lord rarely gives us the strength that we need before we need it. In order to experience His strength, we must first express our faith with that one small step. In his book, Against the Flow, an Oxford professor by the name of John Lennox, he shares his encounter with a Russian Christ follower who endured years in a Siberian prison simply for the crime of teaching his children about the Bible. In his book, Lennox writes this. He said, he described to me that he had seen things that no man should ever have to see. I listened thinking how little I really knew about life and wondering how I would have fared under his circumstances. As if he had read my thoughts, the man suddenly said to me, "You couldn't cope with that, could you?" Embarrassed, I stumbled out something like, "No, I'm sure you're right." And then he grinned and he said, "Nor could I. I was a man who fainted at the sight of his own blood, let alone that of others. But what I discovered in the camp was this: God does not help us face theoretical situations, but real ones. Like you, I couldn't imagine how I could cope in the Russian gulag, but once there, I found that God met me exactly as Jesus promised His disciples when He was preparing them for victimization and persecution." Guys, standing up and standing out for Jesus is not an easy thing for us to do. We live in a times when that will be called upon us more and more and more. Standing up and standing out for Christ is going to put us at odds with this post-Christian culture. Sometimes we can feel isolated and alone, but we are not the first people to be called to swim against the currents of their culture. In today's Good Life Journal Bible reading plan, we're starting in the book of Daniel. It's a book that's all about how God's people took bold first steps to stand up and to stand out for Him. Daniel faced a decision between the easy way and the right way. He had to choose between the approval of man and his obedience to God. He didn't know how that first leap of faith was going to turn out until he experienced the Lord's faithfulness on the other side. He didn't know how that first step was going to turn out until he trusted God to take the first step. So, Good Life, what first steps are you facing today? Do you believe that God will meet you with His strength and love on the other side of your obedience? Now, I encourage you, maybe take time today to dive into the story of Daniel to see how God is always faithful to those who are willing to take bold and obedient first steps. Hopefully you'll join us also on Sunday at 10 o'clock at the church as we wrap up our study in Isaiah. We look forward to gathering together, and until then, let's be a people who love enough.